The rain pounded against Clara's apartment window as she sat hunched over her laptop, editing a mundane article about city traffic. It had been another uneventful day in her quiet, predictable life. Then, the doorbell rang. Clara frowned. It was nearly midnight. She rarely had visitors, and no one had called to say they were coming. Cautiously, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. When she opened the door, she found only a plain white envelope on the ground. Her name was scrawled across the front in handwriting she hadn't seen in years. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It couldn't be. The handwriting was her mother's, perfect cursive, the loops in her name unmistakable, but her mother had been dead for 5 years. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. The message was brief. Do not trust the living. Meet me at the place where we said goodbye. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words didn't make sense. Who would send something like this? And what was the place where we said goodbye? Memories flooded back. Her mother's funeral, the small cemetery on the outskirts of her hometown. It was the last place she had seen her mother's face, pale and serene in a coffin. But this letter, it was impossible. A second glance at the envelope made her stomach churn. The postmark wasn't dated, no return address. The envelope smelled faintly of lavender, her mother's favorite scent. Clara's logical mind screamed at her to throw the letter away. It had to be a prank, but a quieter, deeper part of her whispered something else. What if it wasn't? She barely slept that night. By morning, her resolve was clear. She would go back to her hometown and find out who or what had sent the letter. But as Clara packed her bag, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every shadow in her small apartment felt a little too dark, every sound a little too sharp. She would go to the cemetery. She had to. But something told her this journey wouldn't end with answers. It would only lead to more questions. The road to Clara's hometown was longer than she remembered, winding through thick woods that seemed darker than they had in her childhood. By the time she arrived, dusk was settling, casting eerie shadows across the small town she had tried so hard to leave behind. Clara parked her car outside the cemetery gates. The iron bars rusted and twisted with age. The place felt abandoned, as though even the dead had been forgotten. The only sound was the creak of the gate as she pushed it open. Her heart raced as she made her way to her mother's grave, guided by memory. The headstone was just as she remembered, simple and unassuming. But what caught her attention was an object propped against it, another envelope. This time, the message inside was even stranger. The key is in the roots. Follow the tree with the broken limb. Clara scanned the cemetery, her pulse quickening. Broken limb? There were dozens of trees here. Some were ancient and gnarled, their limbs twisted like claws. But one tree stood out, a massive oak with a jagged branch dangling by a thread, swaying unnaturally in the still air. Her footsteps felt heavy as she approached. At the base of the tree, the ground was soft and freshly disturbed. Kneeling, she began to dig with her bare hands, the soil cold and damp beneath her fingers. It wasn't long before she felt something hard. She pulled it free, a small, rusted box. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single key, old and tarnished, tied to a faded ribbon. "What is this?" Clara whispered to herself. The sound of a twig snapping behind her made her freeze. She turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing there. But the cemetery was empty, or so it seemed. She grabbed the box and stood up, scanning the area. The shadows felt alive, shifting unnaturally in the fading light. Clara's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity won. As she looked back at her mother's grave, something caught her eye, a faint symbol etched into the stone, one she had never noticed before. It was small, almost hidden, but unmistakable, a circle crossed by 3 jagged lines. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a warning she had once dismissed: stay away from the old house. Clara hadn't seen the house in over a decade, but the memory of it had never left her. Perched at the edge of the woods, it had always seemed more like a relic than a home. Time had not been kind to it. The wooden frame was warped and sagging, the windows cracked or missing entirely. Vines crept up the walls like veins, as though the earth itself wanted to reclaim the building. Clara parked her car a few yards away and stared at the structure, her fingers tightening around the rusted key in her pocket. Why had her mother warned her to stay away from this place? What could possibly still be here after all these years? The door groaned as Clara pushed it open, her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness inside. Dust hung in the air, and the scent of mildew was overwhelming. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, the wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, the broken chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. But something felt wrong. As she moved deeper into the house, she noticed strange symbols carved into the walls. Circles, jagged lines, and shapes she couldn't understand. They weren't there when she was a child. Clara's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before stabilizing. Her breath hitched. Was it her imagination, or had she heard faint whispers coming from upstairs? She hesitated, but forced herself to climb the staircase. The steps creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent house. At the top, she turned toward the door to her mother's old bedroom. It was slightly ajar, and something glinted in the darkness beyond. Pushing the door open, Clara's flashlight landed on a strange sight. The bed had been stripped bare, but in the center of the room was a table with a single object on it, a small mirror. As she approached, she realized the mirror wasn't reflecting her face. Instead, the surface seemed to swirl with a foggy silver light. And then, just for a moment, she saw something else, a shadowy figure standing behind her. Clara spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The room was empty. Her heart raced as she turned back to the table. Beneath the mirror was another envelope, identical to the others. Her fingers felt numb as she opened it and read the words, "The answers lie in the past. Look beneath the floor." Her flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't recover. The room was plunged into darkness. Clara fumbled for her phone, using its weak light to scan the room. Then she saw it, a loose floorboard near the corner. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Beneath was a hidden compartment, and inside it, a stack of old photographs tied together with a ribbon. As Clara flipped through the pictures, her blood ran cold. The faces were familiar. Her mother, her father, and a little girl who looked exactly like her. Except this girl wasn't her. She was wearing clothes Clara had never seen, standing in places Clara had never been. The last photo was the most chilling. It showed the little girl standing with her parents in front of this very house. But the shadow of a tall figure loomed behind them, something faceless, something wrong. Clara dropped the photos and stumbled back, her breathing ragged. A sudden crash from downstairs made her jump. She wasn't alone in the house anymore. Clara froze, the sound of the crash still ringing in her ears. The house, which had been eerily silent moments ago, now seemed alive. Shadows danced across the walls, and the air felt suffocatingly heavy. She clutched the flashlight in one hand and the rusted key in the other. Forcing herself to move, she tiptoed to the top of the staircase, peering down into the darkness below. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. But then she heard it, a faint, low whisper. It wasn't a single voice. It was many, overlapping and indecipherable, like dozens of people speaking at once. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but the whispers grew louder, filling her ears, drowning her thoughts. They seemed to be calling her name. "Clara, Clara." Her grip on the railing tightened. She couldn't turn back now. She descended the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing through the house. When she reached the bottom, she noticed something strange. The symbols carved into the walls were glowing faintly, as though lit from within. The light pulsed, dim and uneven, like a heartbeat. The whispers seemed to come from the living room. Clara stepped inside, and her flashlight flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. In the center of the room stood an old rocking chair, swaying gently, though no one was in it. Her breath hitched as she saw another envelope lying on the chair. With trembling hands, she picked it up and tore it open. "You are not alone. The truth is in the basement." The basement. Clara's stomach twisted. She had never liked that place, even as a child. It had always felt wrong, as though something was watching from the shadows. But she couldn't stop now. She had to know what was going on. The basement door creaked open with a sound that made her shiver. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, and the darkness below was impenetrable. The whispers followed her as she descended, growing louder with each step. When she reached the bottom, the smell of damp earth and mildew hit her like a wave. Her flashlight illuminated rows of shelves filled with dusty jars and cobwebs. But in the center of the room was something that didn't belong, a wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to run, to leave this cursed place behind, but something stronger, a pull she couldn't explain, urged her forward. She knelt by the chest and pushed the lid open. Inside was a collection of strange objects, an old doll with missing eyes, a broken locket, and a stack of yellowed papers. As she reached for the papers, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Clara picked up the top sheet and saw it was a letter, but this time the handwriting wasn't her mother's. It was jagged and chaotic, as though written in desperation. The words sent chills down her spine. They took her. She was never yours. Find the truth before it finds you. A loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Clara's flashlight flickered once more before plunging her into total darkness. And then, in the pitch black, she heard it. A single voice, deep and cold, whispering directly in her ear. Clara froze as the voice whispered in her ear. She spun around, her flashlight useless in the heavy darkness. Her heart pounded as fear gripped her. The basement felt alive now, strange sounds echoing around her. She heard scratching noises, like nails scraping on stone, and faint, heavy breaths. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. No answer. The scratching grew louder, circling her in the dark. She clutched the rusted key in her hand, holding it tightly like it might protect her. Desperate for light, Clara turned on her phone's flashlight. Its weak glow barely lit the space around her. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and moving. Then she saw it. A shape crouched in the corner of the room. The figure looked human, but something was wrong. Its arms and legs were too long, its head tilted oddly to the side. Two glowing eyes stared at her, unblinking. Clara froze in fear. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. "Stay away," she whispered. The figure's head jerked sharply. Slowly, it started to stand, its movements unnatural. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out. She backed away, tripping over the chest behind her. Her breath came in short gasps as the figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes locked on her. Her phone's light flickered, and panic set in. She clutched the old key and held it up. "Leave me alone," she screamed. The figure stopped, staring at the key. For a moment, it didn't move. Then, it tilted its head, as if it recognized the object. It spoke one word in a quiet, cold voice, "Yours." Clara shivered. Before she could react, the figure lunged at her, faster than anything she'd ever seen. She screamed and jumped back, just barely avoiding its grasp. Her flashlight suddenly turned on again, and the figure melted into the shadows, disappearing as though it had never been there. Clara scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking. She couldn't stay in the basement. The thing was still there, watching, waiting. She grabbed the papers from the chest and ran up the stairs. The whispers returned, louder now, angry and full of hate. When she reached the main floor, the front door slammed shut on its own, shaking the entire house. Clara didn't stop to think. She yanked it open and ran to her car. Inside, she locked the doors and started the engine. Her headlights lit up the foggy yard as she drove away, her hands trembling on the wheel. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The figure was standing in the upstairs window, its glowing eyes watching her as she drove away. In her lap, the papers she had grabbed felt heavier. She looked down and gasped. The top page had changed. New words were written in bold, dark ink. "You took what was mine. Now it's coming for you." You shouldn't have come back. Clara's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, the words on the paper repeating in her mind. "You took what was mine. Now it's coming for you." She couldn't understand. What had she taken? Who had written the note? And what was that thing in the basement? The dark road stretched ahead, and Clara's headlights barely pierced the fog. The farther she drove, the quieter the world became. No wind, no crickets, just silence. Suddenly, her car radio crackled to life. Static filled the air, and faint whispers started seeping through. They sounded like the ones from the house, murmuring words she couldn't understand. Clara slammed the radio off, but the whispers didn't stop. They were coming from inside the car now. She pressed the gas pedal harder, desperate to get away, but then the road changed. It wasn't the highway anymore. It was an old dirt road surrounded by trees, the same road that led back to the house. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." She turned the steering wheel sharply, trying to find another path. But no matter which way she turned, the car stayed on the dirt road. And then her headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the same creature from the basement, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Clara slammed the brakes, her car skidding to a stop. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. She fumbled for the papers on the passenger seat, desperate for answers. As she flipped through them, one photo slipped out. It showed her mother holding a baby, but the baby wasn't her. It was someone else, someone who looked like her but wasn't. Beneath the photo were scrawled words. The first was mine. The whispers grew louder, filling the car as the figure began to walk toward her. Its long, unnatural limbs seemed to stretch with every step. Terrified, Clara threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered, leaving her in total darkness. In the silence, she could hear it breathing, closer and closer. Desperate, she grabbed the old key from her pocket. "What do you want from me?" she screamed. For the first time, the figure stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on the key. Then, in a voice that sent chills down her spine, it spoke. "Give it back." Clara didn't know what it meant. Give what back? The key? The photo? She held out the key, her hand trembling, but the figure shook its head slowly. "Not the key," it whispered. "The life." The words hit Clara like a punch. A memory she had buried deep began to surface. Her mother's warnings, the strange things she wasn't allowed to ask about. Had someone been taken to give her life? The whisper stopped suddenly, and Clara looked up. The figure was gone, but when she glanced in her rearview mirror, it was there, sitting in the back seat. Its glowing eyes met hers, and it whispered, "You can't run. You must pay." Clara screamed as the car plunged into darkness, her world spinning into chaos. Clara's scream echoed into silence as the car's engine died completely. She turned to look at the back seat, but it was empty. The figure was gone. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the car door. She had to get out. The air inside the car felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest. As soon as she stepped out into the cold night, the whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her. The fog seemed to close in, and the dirt road stretched endlessly in both directions. Clara clutched the key and the papers, her knuckles white. "What do you want from me?" she cried out into the night. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, deep, raspy, and cruel, spoke from the shadows. "You should ask your mother." Clara froze. Her mother? What did she have to do with this? The fog parted slightly, and in the distance, Clara saw the house again. It loomed in the dark as though it had never left. "No," Clara whispered. She had driven miles away. How was she back here? But the voice called again, pulling her toward the house. She knew she couldn't fight it. Something was forcing her to return. Reluctantly, she walked up the steps and pushed open the door. The house was colder now, darker, and the whispers were deafening. On the floor in the living room, a single candle flickered. Beside it was an old photo album. Clara knelt and opened it. The first few pages were normal, pictures of her as a baby, her mother smiling. But as she turned the pages, the photos began to change. There was a photo of her mother holding a baby, but it wasn't Clara. The baby looked like her, but had a different mark on its cheek, like a scar. Then there was another photo. Her mother stood next to a tall man in a dark cloak. His face was shadowed, but his hand rested on the baby's head. The words beneath the photo made Clara's stomach drop. "The bargain is made." "What bargain?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking. The shadows around her seemed to move, and the voice answered, "To save you, another was taken. Now the debt must be repaid." Clara's heart raced as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Her mother had made a deal, a trade. But for what? Her life. Before she could think further, the floor beneath her creaked loudly. The shadows grew darker, thicker, as though they were alive. The voice grew louder, cold and unrelenting. "She gave you life, but she gave me hers." The room spun as Clara felt the weight of the truth. Someone, another child, had been taken for her to live, and now that stolen life wanted revenge. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. From the shadows, the glowing eyes appeared again. closer this time. The voice hissed, "I am the one who was forgotten, and I have come to take back what is mine." The candle went out, plunging Clara into total darkness. The darkness wrapped around Clara like a suffocating blanket. She couldn't see, but she could feel it, something moving closer, its cold breath brushing against her skin. "Take back what?" Clara stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The answer came, chilling and clear. "Your life." The shadows surged forward, forcing Clara to stumble back. Her flashlight flickered to life on its own, casting an eerie glow. The beam landed on a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a girl, a child, no older than 10. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes glowing faintly with a mix of sorrow and rage. On her cheek was the same scar Clara had seen in the photo. "You're her," Clara whispered. "The baby in the photo." The girl tilted her head, her voice soft but sharp like a blade. "I was her until you took my place." Clara shook her head, panic rising. "I didn't take anything. I didn't know." The girl's eyes burned brighter red, and the shadows around her twisted like living things. "Your mother knew. She traded my life for yours. You were sick, dying, and she begged for help. She made the deal." Clara's knees buckled. Memories she didn't know she began flooding back, her mother crying, holding her as a baby, whispering apologies over and over. "But you're alive," Clara said desperately, gesturing to the girl. "You're here." The girl stepped closer, her voice cold. "I'm not alive. I was left in the darkness, forgotten. While you grew up, I rotted away. Now it's your turn to pay." The shadows lunged at Clara, wrapping around her wrists and ankles. She struggled, screaming as the girl approached. "Wait," Clara cried. "There must be another way. Please." The girl paused, her expression flickering with something, hesitation maybe, but the shadows tightened, pulling Clara to her knees. "Why should I let you live?" the girl hissed. "You lived the life that was mine. I had nothing. No love, no light, only pain." Tears streamed down Clara's face. "I didn't choose this. I didn't know. Please, let me fix it." The girl's head tilted again, her glowing eyes narrowing. The shadows loosened slightly. "Fix it?" Clara nodded frantically. Yes, I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what to do." The girl's voice dropped to a low whisper, full of menace. "Return what was taken." Before Clara could respond, the floor beneath her cracked open. She screamed as she was pulled into a swirling void of darkness and screams. When she opened her eyes, she was in a different place, a forest at dusk. The air was thick with fog, and the trees seemed to whisper her name. Ahead of her was an old stone altar. On it rested a small wooden box, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Clara's instincts told her this box held the answer. As she approached, the girl's voice echoed in her head. "Open it, and your debt will be paid. But beware, what is given cannot be undone." Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the box. She could feel its energy, pulsing with a life of its own. "What's inside?" she asked aloud, her voice trembling. The girl's laughter echoed through the trees. "The truth." Clara's fingers brushed the lid. The moment she touched it, a surge of memories and emotions flooded her mind. She saw her mother, younger and desperate, kneeling before a cloaked figure. "I'll do anything," her mother had pleaded. "Save my baby, please." The figure had nodded. "A life for a life," it had said. "Your child will live, but another will be taken." Clara yanked her hand back from the box, shaking. She finally understood. Her life had been spared at the cost of the girl's. The girl's voice returned, softer now but no less haunting. "Choose, Clara. Open the box and end it, or keep running. But know this, I will follow you forever." Clara's hands shook as she stared at the box. Could she give back the life she had been given, knowing it wasn't hers to begin with? Tears filled her eyes. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and made her choice. Clara's trembling hands hovered over the glowing box. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest. The forest held its breath, the shadows lingering like silent watchers, waiting for her to make her move. The girl's voice echoed again, its chill cutting through the air. "You can't escape your fate. Open the box." Clara's heart pounded in her ears. She had no choice now. If she opened it, the haunting would end, but would she survive? Was she ready to face the consequences of a bargain made long before she was even born? She whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't choose this." The girl's face softened, her glowing eyes dimming slightly. "It wasn't your choice, but it's your debt to pay." Clara closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. The memories of her mother, the love, the desperation flooded her mind. Her mother had tried to save her, but at what cost? "I'll do whatever it takes," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Just let it be over." With a trembling hand, she reached for the box and slowly lifted the lid. The moment it opened, a blinding light shot out, swallowing the forest. Clara gasped, feeling an icy cold seep through her, her body jerking with the force of the light. Her mind was filled with an explosion of images. Her mother's pleading face, the girl's empty eyes, the cries of a life lost, and then nothing. When Clara opened her eyes again, she wasn't in the forest anymore. She stood in a void, endless and dark, with only the girl standing before her. Her glowing eyes had faded, replaced with an unsettling calm. "You've returned what was taken," the girl said, her voice softer now. Clara's heart ached. "But what about me? What happens to me?" The girl's face remained unreadable. "You did as you should, but the debt can never be fully repaid." Clara's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" The girl's gaze darkened, and the shadows around them began to shift. "You can never truly live. You were never meant to exist. Your life was never yours to begin with." Clara's chest tightened, fear creeping into her bones. The weight of the truth crushed her. Her life had been a stolen one, bought with the life of another, and now it was time to give it back. The girl took a step forward, and Clara felt the coldness settle over her. The deal is finished, but it has taken everything. Everything. Before Clara could say anything, the girl raised her hand. The shadows twisted around Clara, pulling her into the darkness. Clara screamed as the void swallowed her whole, her body fading into the blackness. The girl's voice echoed one last time, "A life for a life." The next day, in the quiet house that Clara had once tried to escape, the key and the box rested silently on the floor. The air was heavy with a deep, unsettling silence. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a name, Clara's name, carried on the breeze like a forgotten memory. The house remained untouched, its secrets sealed forever. The girl her debt paid was gone, her existence now nothing more than a distant echo. And Clara? Her name would be forgotten, her life no longer part of this world.